The pass had been erased from the world. Snow drove sideways through the dark, and the wind came howling off the high peaks hard enough to snap old trees in half. Out there in the open, the cold did not kill slowly. It stopped a man's heart in less than an hour. And yet, beneath the roots of a fallen pine, in a space no bigger than a coffin, a single candle flame burned. It did not flicker. It did not lean. It stood perfectly straight in the dark, while the storm screamed against the walls, clawing at every seam, hunting for the smallest crack, the smallest breath of warmth to steal. The wind wanted in, and a man lay still in that tiny hollow, watching the flame, knowing one thing with terrible certainty. If the wind found a way inside, he would not see the morning. The mountain had taken something from him once. He never spoke its name out loud. But on cold mornings like this one, when the frost lay heavy on the fence rails and the world went silent and white, the man named Roan Calder would stand in the yard and look up at it, the high pass, the place that had swallowed his brother years ago and never given him back. Roan stood there now, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, the steam curling up and vanishing into the gray air. Behind him, the small cabin breathed a thin line of smoke from its chimney. A narrow field, a low fence, a well beside the barn. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And in a few short weeks, it might not be. Inside the cabin, a woman sat near the window where the light was best. Della Calder had a needle in her hand and a piece of worn canvas across her lap. The fabric was old, thin in places. She pulled the thread slow and even, the way her own mother had taught her, mending what most people would have thrown away. She did not look up when the door opened. She knew his step. "He came again," she said. Quiet, not a question. Roan set the cup down. This morning, before light. The man who had come was named Vance Drummond. He owned the warehouse at the edge of town, and a great many other things besides. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, because he never had to. He had laid a folded paper on their table, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and reminded Rowan, gently, almost kindly, that the debt would come due before the deep winter settled in. 1 payment left. Miss it, and the land would belong to him. Della's needle paused, just for a moment. Then it kept moving. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. Roan didn't answer right away. He looked at the canvas in her lap, at her steady hands, at the gray light falling across the floor they had swept 10,000 times. "I told him he'd have his money," Roan said. She finally looked up. Her eyes searched his face the way a woman's eyes do when she has been married long enough to hear the things a man doesn't say. "How?" she said. Not a question either. Outside, small boots crunched across the frozen ground. The door swung open, and a boy came in with the cold clinging to his coat. Eli, 6 years old, maybe 7, with cheeks gone red and a seriousness in him that was almost too big for his small frame. "Pa," the boy said. "I checked the wagon. The wheel still wobbles." Roan crouched down to the boy's level. "Does it now?" "It does." Eli nodded, grave as a judge. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A strip of leather, cut clean, soft from being handled. He held it out. "For if it breaks," the boy said, "you can fix things with leather. You showed me." For a long moment, Roan didn't move. Then he took the strip from his son's hand. and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it more than the boy could know. By noon, the truth of it sat heavy in the cabin air, unspoken and impossible to ignore. There was a way to clear the debt. There was only one: a freight run over the high pass. The last load of the season, bound for a mining camp far on the other side of the mountains, a place cut off now by snow, where men were waiting on supplies they badly needed. Most teamsters had already hung up their reins for the winter. The roads up there had a way of killing careless men, and this, late in the season, these were the cruelest weeks of all. But the pay was enough. Enough to make Vance Drummond's paper disappear forever. Della knew before he said it. She set the canvas down in her lap and looked at the patched, tired fabric. The cover for the wagon, the thing she had been mending all morning. She had not been mending it by accident. "You already decided," she said softly. "I did. That pass took your brother, Roan." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. He flinched, just barely. A tightening at the jaw, a shadow that crossed behind his eyes, and was gone. He did not speak of his brother. Not ever. Not since the winter the mountain had kept him. "I know what it took," Roan said at last. His voice was low, even. "And I know what I'd lose if I stayed home and did nothing." Della stood. She crossed the small room and pressed the folded canvas into his arms. The cover she had spent her morning making whole again. "Then it'll have to hold one more storm," she said. "It only has to hold one more trip," he answered. That afternoon, Roan made his way down to the freight yard below town to ready the load. The wagon was old. He knew it. The front axle had been mended more than once. The left rear wheel carried that faint, stubborn wobble Eli had spotted. One mule stood in the traces, a big, patient draft animal with a frost-pale coat. Her name was Birch, and she was the last living thing the mountain hadn't taken from his brother. Roan ran a hand down the mule's neck, slow and quiet. The animal leaned into the touch the way she always had, the way she'd leaned into a different man's hand once, a long time ago. "Just you and me," Roan murmured. "One more time." There was an old freight boss in the yard that day named Tobias Wren. He had spent the better part of his life moving cargo through that country, and he had the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He walked a slow circle around the wagon, and with every step, his frown deepened. "One mule," Tobias said. "That axle, that cover." He shook his head. "The high pass in deep winter isn't a road, Roan. It's a grave that hasn't been filled yet." "It's the road I've got," Roan said. Tobias rested a weathered hand on the sideboard. He wasn't trying to win. He was just an old man telling a younger one the truth. "Your brother thought the same thing," he said. "Once." Roan went still, but he picked up the freight manifest, and he signed his name, and he handed it back. It was only as the load was being checked over, crate by crate, that Roan paused. One of the crates was lighter than the others, packed careful and tight, marked plain. He knew what was inside. Medicine, supplies the camp on the far side was waiting on, for folks who had no other way to get them before the snow closed the world off entirely. It changed the shape of the thing in his mind. This wasn't only about a paper on a table anymore. It wasn't only about the land, or the debt, or the man who held it. There were people on the other side of that mountain, counting on someone fool enough to come. Roan looked up at the high pass one last time. The clouds were beginning to gather behind it, far off, the color of old iron. Somewhere up there, the mountain was waiting. It had taken his brother. It would not take this. He climbed up into the seat, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue. Birch leaned into the harness, and the old wagon rolled forward, wheels groaning against the frozen ruts. Behind him, on the porch of the little cabin, a woman stood with her arms wrapped tight around herself and a small boy pressed against her side. Della did not call out. She had learned long ago that some goodbyes are better kept quiet, but her eyes never left him until the road bent and the trees closed in, and the man, the mule, and the tired old wagon disappeared into the white. And the mountain watched them come. The road climbed, and the valley let them go. Mile after mile, the wagon lifted away from the warm yellow window of the cabin, away from the well beside the barn, away from the low fence, away from the world where doors closed against the cold, and supper waited on the stove. Up here, there were no doors. There was only the long white throat of the pass, and the trees standing black and silent on either side. They looked, those trees, like watchers, like creatures who had agreed, long ago, never to speak of what they saw. Roan Calder sat hunched on the wagon seat, the reins loose in his gloved hands, his shoulders rounded against the cold. The breath came out of him in slow gray clouds and drifted away. The wheels groaned over the frozen ruts, and the mountain rose ahead of him, white and patient, growing larger with every turn of the road. He had not wanted to come this way. There were easier roads in the world, and harder men to walk them. But the easier roads did not pay a debt before deep winter. And so, here he was, climbing the one mountain in all the world he had sworn he would never climb again. Birch pulled steady beneath him. The mule did not need much guiding. She knew the way better than he did, in the strange manner that animals sometimes know things, in the bone, in the blood, in the deep muscle memory of a creature that had walked this same hard road before, under a different man's hand. That thought sat heavy with him as the wagon creaked upward. A different man's hand. His brother had loved this mule. Sawyer had been that kind of man, the kind who talked to animals the way other people talk to old friends. Low and easy, sharing the day's small troubles with a creature who would never repeat them. He had raised Birch from a gangly knock-kneed thing, all legs and stubbornness, fed her by hand through a hard first winter, named her himself, and called her by that name in a voice gone soft at the edges. And when the mountain took Sawyer, Birch was the only one who came back down. Roan had never been able to part with her. God knew there had been winters lean enough to make him think on it. Winters when the larder ran low and a strong draft mule would have fetched a fair price in town. But every single time he had looked at that patient face, he had seen something of his brother looking back at him, a debt he could not name, a promise he had never once spoken out loud. So he had kept her through the lean years and the hard ones both. You remember him too, don't you, girl? Roan murmured. The mule's long ear flicked back toward the sound of his voice. That was answer enough. The cold deepened as they climbed. It was a dry, biting cold, the kind that does not announce itself with wind but simply creeps in through the seams of a coat and settles against the skin like a cold hand laid flat. Roan pulled his collar higher. He flexed his fingers inside the worn gloves to keep them from going stiff. Behind him, the patched canvas that Della had mended snapped softly in the breeze, holding for now, just as she had promised it would. He thought of her hands, the needle moving slow and even through the worn cloth. The way she had not looked up when he came in, because she had always known his step from any other man's. He thought of the small strip of leather pressed against his chest, the gift from a boy who believed, with all his small heart, that his father could fix anything. And he kept climbing. The first day passed without trouble. That was its own kind of warning, though Roan did not let himself dwell on it. The mountain was patient. It did not strike at the first man foolish enough to wander onto its slopes. It waited. It let him grow comfortable. It let him believe, just a little, that he might slip through unnoticed before it closed its hand. Once, in the long climb of that first afternoon, the road bent past a place Roan knew. He had not planned to look, but his eyes went to it anyway, the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth. A wide shoulder of rock, a stand of leaning pines, a place where the trail dropped away on one side into a steep white ravine. It was near here. The winter the mountain had kept his brother. It had been near here. Roan did not stop the wagon. He did not slow it. But something tightened in his chest as they passed, a fist closing around his heart, and for a moment the cold he felt had nothing at all to do with the air. He had not been with Sawyer at the end. That was the thing he carried. That was the stone he could not set down. The brothers had gone up together, years ago, on a run not so different from this one. And when the weather turned, Roan had made a choice. He had gone one way to look for shelter. He had sent his brother the other, and only one of them had come back down the mountain. Roan looked straight ahead now. He fixed his eyes on the road, and he did not let them wander. "Get up, girl," he said, low. "Nothing back there for us." Birch leaned into the harness, and the place fell away behind them, and the mountain swallowed it back into white. That night he made a cold camp beneath an overhang of rock, the mule close beside him, the two of them sharing what warmth the living can share when the dark presses in. He did not build much of a fire. Wood was precious up here, and the night was long, and there was a strange comfort in the dark that he could not have explained. Before he slept, he checked the load. His hand found the crate that sat a little apart from the others, packed careful and tight, lighter than it looked, marked plain on the lid. He knew what was inside: medicine, supplies bound for the camp on the far side of the pass, where folks were waiting on them, where the snow had already closed the world off, and would close it tighter still, and where some of those waiting could not afford to wait much longer. He rested his hand on the lid of the crate a moment. It had stopped being only about the paper on his table, only about the land and the debt and the smiling man who held it. There were people on the far side of this mountain. They were counting on someone fool enough to come. Roan pulled his blanket up and closed his eyes. And somewhere in the long cold reaches of his sleep, he heard his brother calling, far away, from somewhere in the white, a voice he had not been able to follow then, and could not follow now, no matter how he tried. He woke before dawn with the name still on his lips. Far below, in the small valley, the window of the cabin still burned yellow against the dark. Della Calder had not gone to bed. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, the very same way her husband's coffee had gone cold in his hands that morning, though she did not know that, and could not have known it, and the thought would have undone her if she had. The fire in the stove had burned low to a bed of dull red embers. She made no move to feed it. The cold felt fitting, somehow, as if to warm herself while he was up there in the teeth of it would be a small and quiet betrayal. Eli had finally fallen asleep in the next room, curled small beneath his blankets. He had asked her, before his eyes closed, the question that children always ask. Will Pa be home before the snow covers the fence? She had smoothed the hair back from his forehead and told him what mothers tell their children in the dark, that his father was strong, that his father always came home, that he should close his eyes now and not be afraid because his mother was right here and morning was coming. She had not told him the truth. The truth was that she did not know. The truth was that she had watched those iron-colored clouds gathering behind the high pass all the long afternoon, and something cold had wrapped itself around her heart and would not let go. She knew that mountain. She knew exactly what it had already taken from this family. She had watched her husband become a quieter man in the years since his brother did not come home. She had learned the shape of the silence he carried, and she had learned not to ask after it, and she had loved him through it, without ever once making him speak its name. And now he was up there. A soft knock came at the door. Della's head lifted. Late callers were never good news, not in a small place, not in a hard winter. She rose, smoothed her apron with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady, and crossed the small room and opened the door. Vance Drummond stood on the porch, hat in his hand, his good coat dusted with the first thin flakes of falling snow. He had the look of a man who had timed his visit with care, late enough that the boy would be sleeping, late enough that a frightened woman might be worn down enough to listen. "Forgive the hour," he said. His voice was smooth as a river stone. "I saw your light. I thought we might talk." She did not invite him in. "My husband isn't here," she said. "I know." Something moved behind his eyes, too quick to name, gone before she could be sure she had even seen it. "That is rather why I came." He looked past her into the small warm room, at the worn table, the banked fire, the boy's coat hung small upon its peg. He looked the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided to own. "It's a hard road your husband's taken, Mrs. Calder," Vance went on gently. "The high pass, this time of year." He shook his head slowly, as though the very thought of it pained him. "A great many men have gone up there, and not come down again. I would hate to see your boy left without a father, over a sum of money." The words were kind. The thing living underneath them was not. And Della understood, standing there in her own doorway with the snow falling soft between them, exactly what he was offering. A way out. Sign the land over now. Tonight. Before the storm buried any last chance of payment. Before her husband's body, perhaps, lay somewhere cold beneath that very snow. Take whatever small mercy Drummond chose to extend, and spare herself the long, terrible wait by the window. He was telling her that Roan was already gone. He was telling her to stop hoping. Della stood very straight in the doorway. The wind pulled at her skirts. The snow came down soft and steady, settling on the porch rail, on the man's broad shoulders, on the dark world beyond. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. Then she lifted her chin. "My husband gave you his word," she said, "and he has never once broken it. He will have your money, and you will have nothing from me before he does." A flicker of irritation crossed Drummond's smooth face. Just a flicker. There, and gone. "You're a loyal woman," he said at last. "I will grant you that much." He settled his hat back upon his head, slow and deliberate. "But loyalty doesn't pay a debt, Mrs. Calder, and it has never once brought a man back over that mountain." He touched the brim of his hat, polite to the very last. "I'll see myself out." He walked back into the falling snow, unhurried, certain, and the dark took him. Della closed the door. She leaned her back against it. And only then, only when there was no one left to see her, not the sleeping boy, not the watching town, not the smiling man who waited so patiently for her husband to die, did she let herself begin to tremble. She pressed one hand hard over her mouth, and in the silence of that small, warm room, with the embers dying low in the stove, she did the only thing that was left to a woman in her place. She prayed, not in words exactly, just a long, wordless reaching out into the dark, out the door, up the slope, over the white miles, toward the high pass and the man she loved somewhere on it. "Come home," the reaching said. "Come home, come home, come home." High above her, far beyond the reach of any prayer she knew how to make, the mountain did not answer. The second day, the trouble began. It did not begin the way Roan had braced himself for. He had readied his body for wind, for driving snow, for the slow, grinding cold that wears a man down hour upon hour until he can no longer remember what it was to be warm. What came instead was silence. Around midday, as the wagon labored up a long and open stretch of the pass, the whole world went still. The wind died first. One moment it was there, tugging at the canvas, pushing against the mule's flanks, worrying at the loose snow. And the next, it was simply gone. The pines, which had swayed and whispered all the morning long, fell utterly motionless. The loose snow on the frozen ground lay dead still, not a single grain of it stirring. Even the small sounds of the wagon seemed to shrink and flatten, as though the air itself had thinned. The silence grew so thick it pressed against his ears until they rang. Roan's head came up. A cold sweat broke along his spine, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with the temperature. He had heard of this. The old men in the valley spoke of it sometimes, in low voices, in the way men speak of things that have killed people they once knew. This terrible, breathless calm, the mountain drawing in its breath, pulling all the air on the slope into its great lungs at once, before it struck. The old-timers had a name for what came after, the white hammer. Roan turned slowly in his seat and looked toward the northwest, and there it was, a wall of cloud rolling toward the pass. Not gray, but a bruised and terrible color. The color of old iron and dried blood, churning low across the whole of the sky and swallowing the peaks one by one as it came on. It was beautiful. It was the most frightening thing he had ever laid eyes on. He did not have much time. An hour, perhaps, likely less. Out here in the open, on this bare and exposed shoulder of the mountain, a man caught by such a thing did not see the morning. The cold would come into his blood and slow it and thicken it and stop it. And by the next day, there would be nothing left of him at all but a soft white shape beneath the snow. He knew this the way he knew his own name. He knew it the way he knew the shape of the silence his brother had left behind. "Yeah!" Roan snapped the reins hard. "Get up, Birch! Move, girl! Move!" The mule lunged into the harness. The wagon jolted forward, picking up speed across the frozen road, the wheels skidding and catching on the icy ruts. They had to clear this open ground. They had to reach the black line of timber on the far side, where the trees might break the wind, where a man might find a wall of rock to crouch against and wait out the worst. The wagon rattled and bounced and groaned. The cargo shifted against the sideboards. Birch's hooves hammered the frozen earth, her breath tearing out of her in great ragged clouds, her ears flat back against her skull. Faster, faster. The wall of cloud rolled closer behind them, blotting out the last of the pale sky. And then the mountain sprang its trap. It happened in an instant. The wagon's right front wheel struck a patch of ice. Black ice. The kind that lies invisible and smooth over the stone. The kind a man never sees until he is already upon it. The wheel slid sideways. The whole iron-heavy weight of the load lurched and shifted and came slamming down onto that single point. And the front axle snapped. The sound of it was enormous. A great splitting crack of old, dry oak, sharp as a rifle shot in the dead silence, that echoed off the granite walls of the pass and went rolling away down the mountain. The wagon dropped. The front end pitched violently to one side, the broken corner gouging deep into the frozen ground. Cargo crashed against the sideboards. The whole rig slewed around with a long shriek of grinding wood, and for one terrible heartbeat, Roan was certain it would roll. Certain the entire load would come down on top of the mule. Birch screamed. There is no other word for the sound a terrified animal makes. It is a sound that goes straight past the ears and into the oldest part of a person, older than language, older than thought. The mule lunged against the harness with every ounce of her great strength, eyes rolling white, hooves scrabbling for any purchase on the ice, and the rigging began to tear, leather and buckle straining and giving way, half the harness ripping loose under the sheer animal force of her fear. Roan was off the seat before he knew he had moved. He hit the ground hard, slipped, very nearly went down, caught himself against the broken sideboard. Snow filled his boots. Pain shot up through his wrist where it struck the wood. He did not feel any of it. He saw only the mule. Birch was thrashing, half tangled in the torn harness now. The dead weight of the broken wagon dragging at her. The panic feeding on itself the way that panic always does. One more wild lunge and she would tear free, or break a leg on the ice, or do herself some worse hurt. And out here, a lame mule was a dead mule. And a man left alone on this pass, with the white hammer coming down, was a dead man. "Easy," Roan shouted. "Easy, girl. I'm right here." He threw both arms around the animal's neck. She fought him. She was 4 times his weight and clean out of her mind with terror, and she threw her great head and very nearly lifted him off his feet. He held on. He pressed his own face against the warm, trembling neck of his brother's mule, and he forced his voice down, 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 low and slow and steady as still water, the way Sawyer used to do it, the way he had heard his brother do it 100 times in barns and on roads, in a voice that animals trusted. "I've got you," Roan said. "I've got you. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." His own heart was slamming against his ribs. His own breath came ragged and torn with fear. But he did not let her hear a single thread of it. He pressed all of his own terror down into some locked and buried place, and he gave the frightened animal nothing but calm, nothing but the low, unbroken murmur of a voice that would not leave her, no matter what came. "Easy now. Easy. That's it. That's my good girl." Slowly, so slowly, the thrashing began to ease. The wild rolling white of her eyes began, by degrees, to settle. The great trembling body shuddered, once, twice, and then stilled. And then she leaned, heavy and grateful and spent, against the man who held her. Birch stood, her sides heaving, foam at her mouth, but still, and alive. Roan stayed where he was a long moment, his arms wrapped around the mule's neck, his forehead pressed to her warm hide. He was shaking now, in the after, the way a body shakes once the worst of a thing has passed. He let himself shake, just for a breath, just long enough. "Good girl," he whispered into her ear. "Good girl, Birch. You're all right." Then he straightened, he turned, and he made himself look squarely at what was left. The wagon was finished. There was no question of it, and no use in pretending otherwise. The front axle had snapped clean through, and a repair like that took half a day with the right tools in a warm and steady barn, not minutes, on an open mountain side, with a storm the color of old iron rolling down on top of him. The wagon would not move again. Not today. Not ever. It sat broken and useless on the ice, canted at a sick and final angle. His livelihood, his last chance, crumpled into the frozen ground. His way out was gone. Roan turned his bloodshot eyes up toward the northwest, where the wall of cloud had grown to swallow half the sky. The first thin breath of wind touched his cheek, the storm's outrider, the herald, the sign that the long, terrible calm was finally ending. The mountain had done it again. It had let him climb. It had let him hope. And then, at the exact moment he could least afford to lose it, it had reached out one cold hand and broken everything. He had less than an hour now. He had a crippled wagon, a spent and frightened mule, a load of freight he could no longer move, and a load of medicine that people on the far side were counting their days against. And he had a choice, written plain and pitiless in the iron-colored sky. Find shelter, real shelter, before the storm came down in earnest, or die here on this pass, the way his brother had died, alone in the white, with no one near to hold his hand at the end. Roan did not let the panic take him. There was no time left for panic. He scrambled up the nearest granite outcrop, his boots punching through the snow crust, and stood at the top with the rising wind tearing at his coat, and he swept his eyes across the slope. He was looking for anything at all. A cabin, a thread of smoke, an overhang of rock deep enough to crawl beneath and wait. There was nothing. The pass offered no mercy. Bare slope and bare gray stone, and the black line of timber too far away to ever reach in time. His eyes raked across the whole of it once, twice, desperate now, finding nothing, nothing, nothing. And then they stopped. About 70 yards down the slope, a great pine had fallen. It must have come down in some past storm, torn up whole by its roots, the way the big old trees sometimes go when the ground beneath them finally lets go. It lay across a shelf of granite, its massive trunk thick as a doorway, the tangled wall of its uprooted roots standing on end like an enormous shield of frozen earth. Most men would have looked at it and seen only a dead tree. Roan looked at it and saw something else. The snow. All across that slope, the snow lay deep and unbroken, smoothed into long white drifts by the day's wind. But beneath the fallen trunk, in the long, low space between the dead wood and the cold rock, the ground was very nearly bare. The wind had swept this entire hillside all the day long, and yet, somehow, it had not reached in there. Roan's eyes narrowed against the cold. His mind, honed by fear into something fast and clear, turned the thing over and over. The wind moved over the pine, not through it. The fallen trunk, the wall of roots, the granite at its back. Together they broke the wind. They turned it. They sent it sliding up and over and away. And in the pocket of stillness they made between them, the snow could not gather, and the cold could not get its claws in. For the first time since the axle had snapped, Roan felt something other than dread. He felt the small, hard spark of a chance. He half ran and half slid down the slope, the wind shoving hard at his back now, and dropped to his knees at the mouth of that low, dark space. He measured it with his eyes and his hands, fast, the way a desperate man measures the thing that might save his life. It was long enough. A man could lie full length in it, and more. The wall of roots blocked the deadly northwest. The heavy trunk made a roof that no fallen sky could break through. The granite shelf made a solid wall at his back. 3 walls, a roof. It was almost. And then a gust of wind came funneling in through the open eastern end of the space. Straight through it, a long, clear gap as wide as a door left standing open. And it cut through his coat like a blade laid flat against the skin. And the cold truth of the thing hit him all at once. This was not a shelter. Not yet. It was a wind tunnel, open at one end. And the storm, when it came down in earnest, would find that open end in a single breath. It would pour through the gap and fill the whole low space, and strip the warmth from his body faster than he could ever hope to make it. He would crawl in here looking for his life, and the mountain would turn his hiding place into his grave. Roan knelt there in the mouth of it, the wind rising now to a low and hungry howl, the first real snow beginning to slant down out of the iron sky. 3 walls. He had 3 walls. He needed a 4th, and he had less than an hour to find one. Or this fallen pine. This last and only chance on the whole bare face of the mountain would become the place where it finally finished what it had started all those years ago with his brother. He crawled back out into the wind. He stood, and his eyes went slowly down the slope to the broken wagon lying useless on the ice, to the heavy oak bed of it, 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, solid as a church door, and somewhere far below, In a memory worn soft as old leather, his grandfather's voice came drifting up to him through all the long years. You don't need a fire, boy. You just need to seal up every path the wind can take. Roan stood very still in the rising storm. He was not looking at a ruined wagon anymore. He was looking at his fourth wall, and it was sitting 70 yards away, down a slope of ice and stone, and it weighed 400 pounds. The decision would have looked like madness to anyone watching. There was no one watching. There was only the wind, rising now to a steady moan across the pass, and the iron wall of the storm sliding down the sky, and a man standing alone on the ice with a choice to make and almost no time left to make it. Roan Calder did not hesitate. He went down the slope to the broken wagon, half sliding on the frozen ground, and he pulled the sledgehammer from where it hung against the sideboard. His hands were already raw inside the worn gloves. He set his feet. He looked just once at the wagon his family's whole future had ridden out on. And then he raised the hammer over his head and brought it down. Clang! The sound of iron striking iron rang out across the slope and was swallowed by the wind. He was not trying to save the wagon. That hope had died with the axle. He was trying to take it apart, to break the heavy oak bed loose from the shattered running gear beneath it. There was no time for a wrench, no time to find the right bolt and turn it slow and clean. There was only brute force, and the storm, and the long minutes draining away one by one. Clang, clang. Sparks flew where the hammer found the rusted bolts. Wood splintered. The whole frame shuddered with each blow. Roan swung again and again, his breath tearing out of him, every stroke costing him air he could not spare, every stroke buying him 1 inch closer to a wall that might keep him alive through the night. His grandfather's voice was in his ears the whole while. You don't need a fire, boy. You just need to seal up every path the wind can take. He had been a small thing when he first heard those words. He had not understood them then. He understood them now, on this bare slope, with the cold reaching for his blood. Understood them in his bones, the way a man understands a thing only when his life has come to depend on it. There came a moment between one swing and the next when his eyes fell on the freight, the crates, the flour, the crate of medicine sitting careful and apart. Some of it might survive the storm out here under a tarp. Some of it would not. And for one strange breath, the old arithmetic ran through his head, the math of debt and payment, of what each piece was worth, of the paper waiting on his table. Then he let it go. The math had changed. It was no longer about what he owed Vance Drummond. It was about whether he would draw breath come morning, about whether a boy in a valley far below would have a father to come home to, or only a long wait by the window that never ended. With one last guttural shout, Roan brought the hammer down. The final iron pin gave way. The heavy oak bed broke free of the running gear, settling onto the ice with a deep and final groan. 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 400 pounds of solid oak. Most men in that moment would have mourned a ruined livelihood. Roan saw a wall. He saw a chance. Now he only had to move it. The work of it began at once, and it was brutal. Roan threaded a length of rope through the stake pockets along the side of the bed, and he wrapped the loose end across one shoulder, and he leaned into it with all his weight. Nothing happened. For one long, awful moment, the wagon bed sat rooted to the mountain as if it had grown there. 400 pounds of dead oak against one tired man on the ice. He set his boots. He adjusted his footing. He leaned again, harder, until the rope bit into his shoulder through the coat and his whole body trembled with the strain. The wood shifted 1 inch. That inch was everything. The heavy platform began to scrape across the frozen ground, slow and grinding, an awful low sound that the wind nearly stole away. Snow packed up beneath the leading edge. Small stones caught and dragged. Twice the whole thing wedged itself fast against an outcrop of granite, and twice Roan had to stop and find a fallen branch and lever it free a few hard-won inches at a time. Progress came in feet, then in inches. The storm clouds spread overhead. The daylight, already thin, began to fail around him. Several times the bed threatened to jam itself for good between the roots and the rock, and each time it cost him another adjustment, another push, another pull, another stretch of his fast dwindling strength. Patience here mattered as much as muscle. When the steepest stretch came, he brought Birch forward. The mule was spent and frightened still, but she leaned into the makeshift harness when he asked it of her, and for a short distance she helped, easing the great oak weight up and over the worst of the broken ground. Roan let her pull only as far as he dared. Then he loosed her and led her aside and stroked her trembling neck. A panicked animal could ruin everything in a single bolt. The rest he would do by hand. The minutes bled away. His shirt was damp with sweat beneath the coat, despite the killing cold. His arms had gone past burning into a kind of distant numbness, but the fallen pine drew nearer with every grinding foot, and at long last, the oak bed lay just below the dark mouth of the shelter. Roan dropped to one knee, his chest heaving, his breath ragged in the rising wind. He let himself rest there for 3 breaths, no more. The mountain gave no rewards for resting. He had set his hands back on the rope, had begun to work the bed into its final place, turning it slow with the lever so its long side would face the open eastern gap, when he heard the sound. At first he thought it was the wind, a thin, high sound, caught and torn away almost before he could be sure he'd heard it at all. He went still. He listened, every nerve drawn tight. The wind moaned, the pine creaked above him. And then it came again, from somewhere down the slope, off in the gathering white. Not the wind. A voice. Roan's head turned. Through the slanting snow, a little way below the fallen pine, half hidden against a hummock of rock, lay a shape that should not have been there. A dark shape. A human shape. Crumpled into the white, one arm flung out, snow already beginning to gather along the back of it. For one terrible heartbeat, Roan did not move. Because he knew this moment. He had lived inside it before, years ago, on a slope not far from this one. A choice between his own safety and someone else's. The cold pressing in, the storm coming down, and a brother somewhere in the white that he had not been able to reach in time. He had made the wrong choice once. He had carried it every day since. Roan was up and moving before the thought had even finished. He half ran, half fell down the slope, the snow sucking at his boots, and dropped to his knees beside the shape. It was a young man, hardly more than a boy, really, younger than Roan by a good 10 years, his face gone gray-white with the cold, his lips cracked, frost in his eyebrows. A small pack lay beside him, and the marks in the snow told their own story. He had been traveling the pass alone, and he had fallen, and he had not been able to get up again. "Hey!" Roan gripped the young man's shoulders. "Hey, look at me!" The boy's eyes fluttered. Found him. Did not quite focus. "Cold," the young man managed. His voice was barely there. Couldn't find the way down. Tried to... Don't talk. Save it." Roan was already running his hands over him, checking for breaks, for blood. One ankle had turned, badly, by the swelling. But the boy was whole. Whole and alive, and freezing to death by inches in the open snow. There was no time to wonder what a young fool was doing alone on the high pass in the teeth of such a storm. There was no time for any of it. There was only the choice. Roan could leave him. The thought came, cold and clear and shameful, and he hated it even as it formed. He could leave him. He had a shelter half built and a storm bearing down, and barely strength enough to save one man, let alone two. Every minute he spent on this stranger was a minute stolen from his own survival. The hard arithmetic of the mountain said, leave him. The hard arithmetic said one was a better bet than two. But Roan had done that arithmetic once before, and he had been doing penance for the answer ever since. No, he said, out loud, to the storm, or to himself, or to a brother who could no longer hear him. Not again. Not this time. He got an arm under the young man's shoulders. He hauled him up. The boy was dead weight, and his cry of pain was thin and lost in the wind. And Roan staggered under him, and the slope was ice, and the shelter was 40 yards away and uphill. He climbed it anyway, one step, then another. The young man's arm across his shoulders, his own legs shaking, the snow driving harder now into both their faces. He talked the whole way, low, steady, the same voice he'd used on the frightened mule, the voice his brother had taught him without ever meaning to. Stay with me, you hear? Stay with me. We're almost there. Almost there. And somehow they were. He got the boy into the low space beneath the fallen pine, eased him down against the granite at the back where it was driest, and pulled his own coat partway off to lay over him. The young man's eyes had closed. His breath was shallow but steady, alive, for now. Roan crouched there a moment in the dark, breathing hard, the weight of what he'd just done settling over him. He had a shelter that wasn't finished, a storm about to break, a spent mule to protect, and now a half-frozen stranger to keep alive through the night. The mountain had just doubled the price of survival, and Roan Calder, God help him, had agreed to pay it. There was no more time for thinking. He worked. He went back to the oak bed and finished what he'd started, levering it slow into its place across the open eastern gap, corner by corner, until at last it slid home beneath the fallen trunk and settled there. And for the first time, the shape of the thing became real. A wall of roots and earth behind, the great trunk for a roof above, the granite at the back, and now the heavy oak bed standing guard across the front. 4 walls, but 4 walls were not enough. Not by themselves. Wind did not need a door. It only needed a gap, a seam, a crack the width of a finger. So Roan began to seal them. He started with the largest opening, the upper gap between the top of the oak bed and the fallen trunk. He pulled the patched canvas free from the wreck of the wagon, the very cover Della had mended at the kitchen table only days before, and he stretched it tight across the space. The wind would strike there first and hardest. Any weakness would show itself fast. Her stitches held. Next came the branches. He gathered dry pine boughs by the armful and packed them into the outer gaps, not for warmth, but simply to fill the space that moving air might otherwise claim. Then the smaller seams. Dead bunch grass went in by the handful, stuffed deep into the narrow places where the wood met the rock. Loose forest duff after it. Frozen dirt, broken loose from the slope with the blade of his shovel, packed hard along the lower edge where the oak bed met the ground. Every handful closed another path the wind might take. He worked without pause, his fingers going numb, then past numb. Torn sections of a saddle blanket filled the places the canvas could not reach. Beneath the exposed shelf of roots, he found patches of dry, gray lichen and old moss, sheltered from the weather, and he pushed them gently into the cracks too small for the grass. Those tiny openings worried him most of all. The large gaps announced themselves. A man could see them and feel them and fill them. It was the small ones that hid. A needle-thin stream of cold air, no wider than a thread, could steal away more warmth than it ever seemed it should. Slowly, the shelter changed its shape. Canvas, grass, dirt, branches, old blanket, moss. None of it was anything alone. None of it was strong. But together, packed seam by seam into that low, dark space, they began to force the wind to work for every inch. At one corner of the oak bed, Roan stopped. He reached into his coat. The short strip of leather Eli had given him still rested exactly where he'd placed it, against his chest, just over his heart. He drew it out. He threaded it through one of the stake pockets, and he used it to tie down a loose section of canvas that would not stay. For one breath, his hands went still. His son's gift. For if the wagon breaks, you can fix things with leather. The boy had been more right than he could ever know. Roan pulled the knot tight. Only one opening remained now. A small vent, no wider than a man's wrist, set on the side away from the storm, to let the bad air out and a little good air in. Everything else was sealed, every seam packed, every path closed. He brought Birch into the narrow pocket beside the root wall where the granite curved in and the worst of the wind would pass overhead. He stretched a spare piece of canvas across it and braced it with boughs. It was rough, it was crude, but the difference, the moment it was done, was something he could feel. Then he crawled inside, into the dark, beside the sleeping stranger and out of the reach of the wind, and he struck a match. A short stub of candle caught the flame and filled the cramped space with a thin and trembling yellow light. The young man's gray face softened in the glow. Birch's breath sounded close and steady through the wall of boughs. For a few seconds, everything seemed perfect. The flame stood straight up. Nothing moved. The howl of the storm outside felt suddenly very far away, kept out, beaten, held at the door by a wall made of nothing but scraps and stubbornness. Roan let himself breathe, and then the flame leaned, only a little, only the smallest fraction, barely enough to see. The tip of it bent just once toward the floor. Roan went very still. A moment later, he felt it, a thin stream of cold air brushing across the back of his wrist. It lasted less than a second, but it told him everything he needed to know. Somewhere down near the ground line, beneath the oak bed, the wind had found a way in. The opening could not have been large. It did not need to be. The mountain was not looking for a doorway. It had never needed a doorway. A crack would do. A single thread of moving air, working all night long, patient as the mountain itself, would carry off the warmth a breath at a time, until there was nothing left in this little space but the cold, and two men who would not wake. Roan pinched out the candle. In the dark, the truth came to him, plain and chilling. Had he lit that candle and seen the flame stand straight and lain down satisfied to sleep, had he trusted the wall without testing it, he would not have woken. Neither of them would. Della would have become a widow before the sun came up, and never known the reason why. A finger-width crack. That was all it would have taken. He crawled back out into the storm. It had come down in full now. The wind drove the snow sideways through a darkness so complete he could barely see his own hands. The cold was a living thing, clawing at every inch of him, hunting for the seams in his coat the same way it hunted for the seams in his wall. He found the leak by feel, down low beneath the oak bed, where the frozen ground had not packed tight enough. He cut more dirt from the slope with his shovel, mixed it with snow crust and duff into a heavy, freezing mud, and he packed it along the base of the wall, layer over layer, building a low berm against the seam. Then he stacked pine boughs outside it, so that when the drifting snow came, as it surely would, it would catch against the branches and pile where he wanted it. The storm itself would finish the wall for him. That was the secret his grandfather had tried to give him all those years ago. You did not fight the mountain. You did not beat it with strength. You made it do your work. You turned its own fury into your fourth wall, your fifth, your roof, and your floor. You sealed every path the wind could take, and then you let the wind bury you safe. When it was done, when his hands could no longer feel the shovel and his whole body shook with the cold, Roan crawled back inside. He struck the match again. The candle flared to life, and this time the flame stood perfectly straight. It did not lean. It did not bend. It burned steady and gold in the dark while the storm screamed against the walls and found no way in. Roan looked at that small, motionless light for a long, long moment. Then he looked at the young man breathing beside him, at the wall of boughs that hid the warm bulk of his brother's mule, at the patched canvas overhead, holding, Della's stitches holding, against everything the night could throw. He lay down on his side, his back against the oak wall, his shoulder near the granite, and out beyond the little flame, beyond the four walls made of scraps and grief and stubbornness, the white hammer came down on the mountain with all its fury, and did not find a way in. Inside the little shelter, the dark was nearly complete. Roan let the candle burn only a moment longer, just long enough to see the young man's face, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the frost melting from his eyebrows in the small warmth of the flame. Then he pinched it out between two fingers. There would be no fire tonight, no lantern, no light at all. Every scrap of warmth mattered now, and a flame ate warmth the way the cold ate everything else. So he sat in the dark, And he listened to the storm throw itself against the walls he had made, and he set his mind to the only work left to do, keeping the boy alive. The young man was failing. Roan could feel it. The cold had been in him too long out there in the snow, and even sheltered now, his body had not yet found the strength to climb back from the edge it had wandered toward. His breathing was too shallow. His skin, where Roan touched it, was cold as the granite at their backs. Roan knew what the cold did to a man. He had seen it. He carried the memory of it like a stone. You did not let a freezing man lie still and quiet. That stillness was the cold winning. That quiet was the long sleep that had no morning on the other side of it. So Roan moved close. He worked his own coat around them both, sharing what heat his own body still held, pressing his warmth against the young man's back, the way the living warm the living when there is nothing else left to give. He chafed the boy's cold hands between his own. He pulled the saddle blanket over them and tucked it close at every edge. And he talked. "Stay with me now," he said, low and steady. "You hear me? You don't get to quit. Not on my watch." The young man stirred. A thin sound came from him, half a word. "That's it," Roan said. "Keep doing that. Keep making noise. Long as you're griping at me, I know you're still in there." For a long while, that was all there was. The dark, the storm, a man's low voice, and a boy's slow breathing, and the cold pressing in on every side, and being held back, inch by stubborn inch, by warmth and will in the four walls of a broken wagon. Slowly, so slowly Roan could not have said when it began, the boy began to climb back. His breathing deepened. The terrible cold of his skin gave way by degrees to something that was almost living warmth. And after what might have been an hour or two or half the night, time had lost its shape in that dark place. The young man's eyes came open, and this time they found Roan's face and held it. "Where?" the boy whispered. "Where am I?" "Someplace warm," Roan said. "Or near enough. You're out of the wind. That's the main thing." The young man tried to move and went rigid with pain. His ankle. Roan put a hand on his shoulder, easy, holding him still. "Don't. You turned that ankle bad. It'll keep till morning." He found the canteen tucked inside his coat, still liquid, kept from freezing by his own body heat, and held it to the boy's cracked lips. Small sips, slow, the young man drank. Some color came back into his gray face. "You pulled me," he said, wondering, as the memory found him. "Out there, in the snow, you carried me up." "I did. Why?" The question landed in the dark, simple and honest, the way a half-frozen boy might ask anything. Roan was quiet a moment. "Because leaving you wasn't a thing I could live with," he said at last. "Not again." The boy did not understand the last word. Not yet. But something in the way Roan said it kept him from asking. His name, it turned out, was Jess. He told Roan that much, in pieces, over the next stretch of the long, dark hours, his voice growing stronger as the warmth crept back into him. He was young, younger even than he looked, and he had looked young enough. He had wanted to be a freight man, a teamster, working the high routes the way the older men did, the men he'd watched all his life with a boy's hungry admiration. He had thought the mountain routes would make him. He had thought wrong. "Everybody told me not to," Jess admitted somewhere in the dark. The old man at the yard, Wren, he said the past kill me. Said I didn't have the years on me yet. A weak, shamed laugh. Figured he was just an old man who'd forgotten what it was to be young. Figured I'd show him. And how's that working out? Roan said. Not unkind. Jess was quiet. I fell, he said finally. Not long after the wind went still. That strange quiet before the storm came down. Slipped on the ice and went down a slope and turned my ankle and couldn't get back up. Couldn't make the next ridge. Couldn't make anything. His voice thinned. I lay down. I knew I shouldn't. Everybody knows you don't lie down. But I was so tired, and the snow was so soft, and I just lay down. And I thought, well, this is it. This is how it ends. And nobody even knows I'm up here. Roan said nothing for a moment. The storm filled the silence. Somebody knows now, he said. And in the dark he felt the boy's breathing catch, just once, the way breathing catches when a person has come very close to giving up, and something pulls them back, and they have not yet decided whether to be grateful or only afraid. Far below the storm, in the small valley, the window of the cabin had not gone dark in 2 days. Della Calder kept the stove lit day and night. It was not for the warmth, or not only. It was something older than that, something she could not have put into plain words if she had tried. A lit stove meant a home that was waiting. A lit stove meant a man had somewhere to come back to. So she fed it, and she banked it, and she fed it again, and she did not let it go out, as if the small fire in her kitchen were a thread tied to the man on the mountain, and to let it die would be to let go of the thread. Each morning, the boy went to the door. Eli would pull on his coat and walk out onto the porch and stand there in the cold, staring up at the white hills beyond the fence, watching the road. He never said much. He only looked for a long while, and then he would come back inside, and his small face would tell her everything his mouth did not. "He's still up there, Ma," the boy said on the second morning. "Isn't he? He's stuck somewhere up there in the snow." Della knelt down in front of her son and held his cold face in her warm hands. "Your father," she said, "is the most stubborn man I have ever known. And stubborn men do not freeze on mountainsides. They are far too contrary to die when somebody up there might want them to." It made the boy almost smile. It did not ease the thing in her own chest, which had not eased in 2 days, and which she let no one see. By then, the talk had already reached the valley. Talk traveled faster than any wagon. It came down off the high country on the tongues of men who knew that country well, and the talk all said the same thing. No man could have lived through such a storm on the high pass. No man, no team, no shelter would have stood against it. They said it kindly, most of them. The way people say a hard thing they believe to be true. They said it the way men talk about the dead. A widow. That was the word the valley had quietly begun to use when it spoke of Della Calder. Not to her face. Never to her face. But she heard it anyway, in the gentleness of the women who came by with bread, in the lowered eyes of the men who tipped their hats. A widow. Or near enough to it that the word had started to fit her like a coat she had not asked to wear. She refused to wear it. She kept his coat hanging on its peg by the door, exactly where it always hung, as though he might walk in at any hour and reach for it. She set his place at the table. She would not say the word would not think it, would not let it into the house where her son could catch it. And on the second evening, the smiling man came again. Vance Drummond did not knock this time. He waited at the gate in the falling dusk until she came out to him, because a man like Vance Drummond understood that there are insults that wear the face of courtesy, and making a worried woman walk out into the cold to hear him was one of them. "Mrs. Calder," he inclined his head, "I won't keep you long. I've come to spare you something, if you'll let me." "Spare me," she repeated. The waiting. His voice was soft as ever, soft as snow. "I think you know, by now, what the men are saying. I think you've heard it. And I think a woman as sensible as yourself has begun to understand that hoping past a certain point becomes its own kind of cruelty." He let that sit. "I came to offer you a clean end to it. Sign the land over to me, tonight. And I will see to it you and the boy are looked after through the winter. You needn't spend another night staring at that road." Della stood very still at her own gate. Behind her, in the cabin window, the stove light burned warm and gold. She could feel it at her back, the way you feel a hand there. "You want me to bury him," she said quietly. "That's what you're asking. You want me to put my husband in the ground in my own heart, tonight, so you can have his land in the morning. While he is, for all you or I truly know, alive. I want to be kind to you." "No." The word came out level and clear and without the smallest tremble. "You want to be early." Something flickered in the smiling man's face. The smile stayed, but behind it, something cold and impatient showed itself just for a moment before he smoothed it away. "You're a sentimental woman," he said. "I'm a faithful one," said Della. "There's a difference, though I don't expect a man like you to know it." She stepped back toward her door, toward the warm light. "My husband gave you his word that you would have your money. He has never broken his word to me or to anyone in all his life. And until I have laid eyes on his body with my own two eyes, not the talk of frightened men, not your kindness, his body, I will go on believing that he is coming home. You may wait for your money the same as I am waiting for my husband. We will both of us see who is rewarded for their patience." And she went inside, and she closed the door, and she did not let him see her hands shaking until the latch had fallen. Then she leaned against the door in the warm gold light, with her son asleep in the next room and the stove burning low, and she wept, quietly, the way a strong woman weeps when she has held the line all day and has earned, at last, a moment to be afraid. "Come home," she whispered, "to the dark, to the mountain, to the man. Please, come home." High on the pass, in a shelter made of scraps, the man she was praying for had begun, at last, to talk. Not about the cold, not about the storm, not about any of the small, urgent things that filled the hours. About his brother. It started small. It always does. Jess, fighting the pull of sleep, had asked him a simple question. What made a man come up a road like this one, in weather like this, with only one mule and a wagon held together by other men's pity? And Roan, in the dark, with the storm screaming and the boy's life still hanging by a thread, found that he wanted to answer. Found, for the first time in years, that he needed to. "I had a brother," Roan said. The words felt strange in his mouth. He had not said them aloud in a long time. He had not let himself. "Older than me. better than me, in most every way that counts. He had a gift with animals. That mule out there, beyond the wall, he raised her from nothing. He could talk a frightened thing down to calm just with his voice. I learned it off him. Everything I did out there tonight, with you and with her, I learned it from him. Jess listened. He did not speak. Somehow he understood that speaking would break it. We worked the roads together, Roan went on. Freight, same as I'm doing now. In one winter, a winter not so different from this one, we got caught. Up here, on this very mountain, not 2 miles from where we're lying. The storm pressed against the walls. The walls held. The weather turned bad, fast the way it does, and we knew we had to find shelter or we'd die out in it. So we split up to cover more ground. He went one way. I sent him one way. I'm the one that said it. I'm the one that pointed and said, you go there, and I'll go here, and we'll holler when one of us finds something. Roan's voice had gone rough. I found something, a overhang of rock, good shelter. And I hollered, and I hollered, and I hollered into that storm, and he never came. The silence in the little shelter had a weight to it now. I went out after him. When the worst of it passed, I went out and I looked, and I found him. Roan stopped, started again. He'd gone down a slope, same as you did. Turned an ankle, maybe. Hurt himself somehow. Couldn't climb back up. And he'd done what a freezing man does when there's no one to tell him not to. He'd lain down, and he'd gone to sleep. And the snow had taken care of the rest. Jess's voice came small in the dark. You couldn't have known, he said. You couldn't have. No, Roan agreed. I couldn't have. I've told myself that 10,000 times. Every night for years, I've told myself that. He drew a slow breath. And it has never once made it weigh any less, because I'm the one who said split up. I'm the one who pointed. I'm the one who came home down this mountain. And he didn't. And there is no amount of. It wasn't your fault in all the world that fixes that. A man just carries it. He carries it. And he goes on. And he doesn't talk about it. And he tells himself that's the same thing as being all right. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jess said very quietly, "That's why you carried me, isn't it?" Roan didn't answer right away. "When I saw you out there in the snow," he said at last, lying down, the way he must have lain down, "I wasn't going to leave you. I couldn't. It was like the mountain had given me the same test twice. And I failed it the first time. I have spent years failing it, over and over, every night in my sleep." His voice steadied. "I wasn't going to fail it again. Not while there was breath in me. Not while there was one single thing I could do." And there, in the dark, something in Roan Calder that had been clenched tight for years began, at last, to ease. He had not been able to save his brother. But he had reached this boy in time. He had pulled him out of the snow. He had carried him uphill through a killing storm and laid him down where it was warm and breathed his own warmth into him and would not let him quit. He had done, this time, the thing he could not do the first time. And though it would not bring his brother back, nothing would ever bring his brother back. It loosened. By some measure, he could feel in his own chest the long, hard grip of the thing he'd carried. Not gone. Grief like that does not go, but lighter, as though By saving this one stranger on this one mountain, he had finally been allowed to set down a part of the weight. What Jess said next, he did not expect. The boy was quiet for a long time, so long that Roan thought he drifted into sleep. And then, in a voice gone thin and ashamed, Jess spoke into the dark. "You ought to know something about why I was up here." He swallowed. "I didn't tell you the whole of it. I told you I wanted the mountain routes. That's true, but it ain't the whole truth." Roan waited. "There's a man down in the valley," Jess said. "A man I owe money to. A man near everybody owes money to, sooner or later. He holds paper on half the county, and he never raises his voice, and he always collects." A bitter pause. "Drummond, Vance Drummond." Roan went very still in the dark. "I owe him more than I can pay," Jess went on. "And he knew it. And a few days back, he comes to me, smooth as anything, and he says he's got a way I can clear it. Easy work, he says. Just take a little run up the pass. Same route a certain freight man's taking, he says, and keep an eye on him, and come back and tell him what becomes of him." The words hung in the freezing air. "He wanted you watched," Jess said miserably. "He wanted somebody up here who could come back down and tell him for certain whether you made it. Whether the mountain—" He couldn't finish it. "He as good as told me he didn't expect you to. He said I'd likely be bringing back word of a dead man, and that it'd clear my debt, and that I shouldn't trouble myself over it because it was only weather and bad luck and no fault of mine." Roan said nothing. In the dark, his jaw had gone tight. His hands had closed into fists at his sides. The cold rage that moved through him was a real and physical thing. That the smiling man should have reached even here, even onto this mountain, even into this little shelter built of grief and scraps. That he should have sent a half-grown boy up a killing pass to watch a man die for the price of a debt. But Roan had been carrying his own dark weight too long to mistake what he was looking at. This boy was not Vance Drummond. This boy was another thing Vance Drummond had used. Another life held cheap. Another person caught in the same patient web. Sent up a mountain to die alongside the man he was meant to watch, and never once told that the mountain might take them both. Two victims of the same cold hand. "He sent you up here to watch me die," Roan said slowly. "And he sent you up here knowing it might kill you too. And he called it kindness, I'd wager. He called it doing you a favor." "Yeah," Jess whispered. "He did." Roan let out a long breath. "Then we're both of us learning the same lesson tonight," he said, "about what that man's kindness is worth." He turned in the dark, and he found the boy's shoulder, and he gripped it, not in anger, in something steadier than anger. "Listen to me, Jess. You're going to live through this night. You hear? You and me both. We're going to walk down off this mountain in the morning, and you are not going to owe that man one more day of your life than the law says you do." His voice was iron. "You came up here to bring him word of a dead man. Instead, you're going to walk into that valley alive, beside the very man he wanted you to bury. And I'd give a good deal to see his face when you do." And in the dark, the boy made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. The mountain had meant to use them both. It had only bound them together instead. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the storm began to change its voice. Roan caught the shift the way a man catches the silence of a clock that has finally wound down, by the sudden absence of a sound he'd stopped hearing. The constant roar, which had filled the world for hours, began to thin. The great battering gusts that had shaken the oak wall came less often now, and with less fury behind them. What remained was a long, low moan, moving across the high ridges, distant, as if the mountain, after all its rage, had finally begun to tire. And inside the shelter, something had changed too. The leaks were gone. One by one, through the long hours, they had sealed themselves. Snow had drifted against the outer boughs, just as Roan had planned, and packed itself tight against the berm, and the wind had pressed it tighter still. The canvas had stiffened with a skin of ice. The grass had compressed. The frozen dirt had hardened into something near as solid as the rock behind it. The storm had buried them, and in burying them, it had finished the wall. The air inside no longer moved. It was cold, still, bitterly cold, but it was a still cold, a held cold, and there is all the difference in the world between cold that moves and cold that does not. The dented tin cup beside them stayed free of ice longer than it had any right to. The water in the canteen stayed liquid. And beyond the wall of boughs, the steady, heavy breathing of the mule had warmed her narrow pocket of the shelter until the heat of her great body seeped through into the space where the two men lay. A working mule, Roan knew, could throw as much warmth as a small stove, if only the wind could be kept from stealing it away. The wind had been kept away. And so Birch's slow breath, in and out through the long dark, became a kind of low fire that gave off no light, warming the boards, warming the air, warming two men and herself, in a shelter built of nothing, while the mountain howled itself hoarse outside, and could not reach a single one of them. Roan lay still and felt the warmth. He thought of his grandfather's voice. You don't need a fire. You just need to seal every path the wind can take. He had not understood it as a boy. He understood it now all the way down. It was true of the cold. He thought, in the dark, that perhaps it was true of grief as well. You did not always need a great roaring blaze to keep a thing alive through the long night. Sometimes you only needed to stop the wind, to seal up the cracks where the cold crept in, to gather close the small warmths that remained. A stranger's breath, an animal's heat, the memory of a woman's hands, and a boy's gift of leather, and to hold them and not let them be stolen, and to wait for the morning that the storm swore would never come. Beside him, Jess had finally fallen into a true sleep, a healing sleep. His breathing was deep, and even now, no longer the shallow gasping of a man on the edge. He would live. Roan reached into his coat and found, by feel in the dark, the folded paper that meant a cabin and a field and a life. He ran his thumb along its edge. Dry. Still dry. And then he found the other thing he carried, the worn strip of leather, tied now into the canvas overhead, holding one corner of his wife's mending against the dying storm. He could not see it, but he knew it was there. He could feel its absence from his pocket and its presence in the wall. And somehow that was the most comforting thing of all. His son's faith, his wife's stitches, his brother's lessons, his grandfather's voice, all of it woven into the four walls that were keeping three living things alive on a mountain that had wanted them dead. The candle, when he lit it one last time before sleep, stood perfectly straight. It did not lean. It did not bend. It burned small and gold and steady in the dark, while far away the storm moaned itself toward silence. And far below, a woman kept a stove burning for a man the whole world had given up for dead. Roan watched the little flame a long moment. Then he blew it out and lay back against the oak wall and let himself, at last, begin to rest. The judgment was not over, but the worst of it had passed. And for the first time in more years than he could count, Roan Calder slept without dreaming of the snow. Morning came quietly, no fanfare, so gentle that a man might have slept through it if he were not waiting. Roan was waiting. He woke in the dark and lay still, listening, the way he had listened all night. And what he heard, or rather, what he did not hear, told him everything. The roar was gone. The battering gusts were gone. The long moan that had moved across the ridges had faded to nothing at all. What remained was a silence so deep and so complete that it had a sound of its own, a soft, ringing emptiness, the hush of a world buried under snow. Nothing struck the oak wall. Nothing rattled the trunk overhead. The storm had spent itself in the night and crept away over the mountains, and the judgment was over. A faint gray light had begun to seep through the frozen canvas above him. He watched it grow. He did not move for a long moment, hardly daring to, as if any sudden thing might wake him from a dream and put him back out in the white. Then, beside him, Jess stirred. "Is it morning?" the boy murmured. "It's morning," Roan said. And the way he said it, the plain, undeniable fact of it, was the most beautiful thing the young man had ever heard. Roan took up the handle of his hatchet and began to chip at the packed snow that sealed the entrance. Ice came loose in chunks. He drove his boot heel through the last crust of it until a hole opened and light poured in, gray and cold and clean. He crawled out into it, and what he saw stopped him where he knelt. The world had been remade. The trail was gone. Simply gone, erased, swallowed whole. The familiar shape of the past no longer existed. Drifts stood chest-high in places, smooth and unbroken and blinding white under a pale sky just beginning to clear. The wreck of the wagon's running gear was a vague mound, one wheel rim showing through. The crate of medicine, wrapped beneath its tarp, sat under a soft white blanket, untouched. Everything was buried. Everything. But them. Roan turned and looked back at the shelter, and for the first time he saw the whole of what he'd built, half buried now beneath the very snow he'd planned for. The oak bed stood frozen into place, a wall now in truth, sealed by drift and ice into the body of the mountain. Della's patched canvas had hardened to a sheet of ice over the layers of bough beneath it. The grass-stuffed seams had vanished under packed white. The storm had searched all night for a way in. It had never found one. A movement near the root wall drew his eye. Birch lifted her great head, frost coating her mane and shoulders, and looked at him with eyes that were clear and calm and alert. Alive. The mule was alive. Roan let out a long breath that he felt he had been holding for 2 days. His legs shook when he tried to stand, the cold and the labor catching up with him all at once. And he had to put a hand against the frozen oak to steady himself. His brother's mule. Alive. The boy he'd pulled from the snow. Alive. And himself, against everything the mountain had thrown. alive. He stood there in the white silence with one gloved hand resting on the scarred wood, and something moved through him that had no name, older than relief, steadier than pride. The feeling of a man who has gone down into the dark, expecting not to return, and has returned. He gave the old oak wall a single gentle tap, the way you might thank a thing that cannot hear you. Then he turned and went to work. The journey down took the better part of the morning to even begin. The wagon would never roll again, and the freight could not be left to the thaw. And so Roan did what mountain men have always done when the world breaks beneath them. He made do. He salvaged 2 side rails from the wreck and lashed them together with rope into a rough frame. He stretched lengths of canvas across it for a dragging bed, a travois, crude, ugly, but able to slide where no wheel could turn. Onto it went the crate of medicine first, then what could be saved of the rest: the flour, the lamp oil, the smaller goods. It was slow, brutal work in the deep snow, and his hands had long since gone past feeling. But he worked steadily, and Jess, pale, his ankle bound tight, useless for hauling but stubborn, did what little he could, handing things up, holding the frame steady, talking. They talked, those two, all the long morning, about small things mostly. The weather, now that it could no longer kill them, the country, the work. But underneath the small talk ran something the night had welded between them. The thing that grows between two people who have lain in the dark together and not been sure of seeing morning. When the travois was loaded, Roan eased Jess onto it atop the soft goods, the boy's bad ankle stretched out before him, and hitched Birch to the frame. The mule leaned into the harness. The whole rig groaned, shuddered, and began to slide across the snow. And so they went down off the mountain, a man on foot leading a frost-pale mule, dragging a sledge of salvaged freight with a half-frozen boy riding on top of it. Slow, so slow. A few yards, then a few more. But every yard was a yard of living, and they took them one at a time. The camp lay on the far side, where the freight had been bound all along. And so they went on, away from home, toward the place that had been waiting for someone fool enough to come. Roan did not let himself think yet of the valley, of the cabin, of the woman and the boy. There would be time. First, there was a thing to finish. A man kept his word. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Near midday, with the smoke of the mining camp finally rising thin against the clearing sky, they came down out of the snow and the timber, and were seen. Men stopped their work to stare. Word had reached the camp days ago that the freight was lost, that no wagon had come through, that no wagon could have, that the man who'd taken the contract had surely died on the pass with everything he carried. And now here he came out of the white, leading a mule, dragging a sledge, with a boy on top, and the long-awaited goods lashed down behind. A man stepped out from the supply shed and stood very still. His name was Harlan Pike, and he had the look of a man who had stopped expecting good news a long time ago and was not quite sure what to do with it now. His eyes went over the mule, over the rough travois, over the boy, over the empty place where a wagon ought to have been. The missing wagon told its own story. Harlan asked no questions. Not yet. Business came first, the way it always did with men of that kind, and Roan respected him for it. The freight was unloaded piece by piece and inspected. And piece by piece, the wonder of it grew. The flour had come through, the lamp oil had survived, and the crate of medicine, the one that mattered most, the one that folks on this side had been counting their hard days against, was whole, untouched, exactly as it had left the valley. It had ridden out a killing storm beneath a tarp, on a mountain that had erased the very road, and it had not been harmed at all. Harlan opened his ledger. He took up a pen. He looked at Roan for a long moment, and there was something in the old quartermaster's face that he did not put into words. Then he wrote. The pen scratched across the paper. The delivery was set down. The receipt was made out, plain and complete. Harlan held it out, and then, instead of letting go, he held Roan's eyes a beat longer. Folks here had given that crate up for lost, he said quietly, and the man carrying it. He glanced toward the boy on the sledge, then back. There's people in this camp who are running out of time waiting on what's in that box. Children among them. They'll see the spring now. He paused. Whatever it cost you, up there on that pass. And I can see it cost you plenty. It bought that. You ought to carry that down the mountain with you. It's worth more than what's on this paper. Roan took the folded receipt with fingers split and reddened by the cold. For a moment he could not speak. He only nodded once and looked away toward the buried peaks, and let the old man's words settle somewhere deep where the other weights had lived so long. A few lines of ink, and a life saved that he had not gone up the mountain to save, and others, here, that he had. He tucked the receipt into his coat, beside the worn paper that meant a cabin and a field, and beside the place where a strip of leather had once rested. And his gaze turned south, beyond the camp, beyond the buried pass, beyond the white miles, to a small valley where a stove had been kept burning for 2 days, and a woman had refused, against all the talk of frightened men, to believe what everyone told her was true. It was time to go home. The trip home took far longer than it should have. The snow had erased the world he knew. Familiar landmarks had vanished beneath the drifts, and more than once, Roan found himself searching for a road he had crossed 100 times before, and could no longer find. He led Birch slow and careful, just riding when his ankle gave out, walking on it when his pride demanded. And as they came down at last toward the valley, they began to meet the talk. It met them on the road, on the faces of the first people they passed, people who looked at Roan Calder the way you look at a man who has come back from somewhere no one comes back from. By then, the whole valley had said the same thing for 2 days, that no man could have lived through that storm on the high pass, that the freight was lost, and the man with it. They had buried him with their words. And here he came, walking down the road, very much alive. The news ran ahead of them faster than they could walk. By the time they neared the valley proper, people were coming out of doorways to see for themselves, hardly believing it, murmuring to one another, falling in quietly behind. It was the boy who saw him first. Eli had gone to the door that gray afternoon to stand on the porch and stare up the white road toward the hills, the same as he had every afternoon. And this time, the road was not empty. A mule, slow and frost-covered, dragging a strange rough sledge, and behind it, on foot, a man in a torn coat. "Ma!" The boy's voice cracked across the still valley. Ma! He was off the porch before the word had finished, boots flying, and he slipped at once and went down hard into the snow and scrambled up and kept running up the road toward his father. Roan dropped the lead rope. He went down on one knee just as the boy crashed into him, and he caught his son up against his chest and held him hard, and felt the small body shaking, and felt his own throat close, and did not trust himself to speak. And then Della was there. She had come out onto the porch at her son's cry, and for one moment she had simply stood, staring, because the thing she had prayed for and refused to stop praying for stood now at the end of her own road, and she could not, for that one moment, make herself believe it. Then Roan lifted his head and looked at her. And she came, down the steps, into the snow, her skirts gathered in one hand, her face open in a way the watching valley had not seen it open in 2 long days. She reached him, and she stopped, and she did not throw her arms around him at once. She looked at him first. She looked at the cold cracks in his skin, the wind burn dark on his cheeks, the healing cut across one brow. She studied his face the way a woman studies a thing she has been afraid she would never see again. Slowly, completely, making sure. Then she rested her forehead against his chest and let out a breath she had been holding for 2 days. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing in any language that would have been equal to it. He held his wife with one arm and his son with the other, in the snow, in front of the whole valley, and the long, terrible waiting was over. She had been right. Faith had brought him home, hers and his, and a boy's, and an old mule's, and 100 small warmths sealed against the cold. But the valley was watching, and the valley was not the only thing that had been waiting. Vance Drummond came through the gathering crowd unhurried, his face composed into something that was almost a welcome and was not a welcome at all. He had not expected this. A man could read it in him if a man knew how to look. The smile was in place, but the eyes behind it had gone flat and busy, recalculating, because the thing he had counted on, the thing he had nearly built his whole patient scheme upon, had just walked down off the mountain very much alive, and the careful machinery of it was coming apart in his hands. Calder, he inclined his head. Well, now, the valley owes you an apology. We'd all begun to fear the worst. His voice was warm as ever. I'm glad of it, truly, but I'd be remiss if I didn't remind you. The debt still stands, and the deadline with it. It does, Roan agreed. He reached into his coat. He drew out the receipt, and then the worn paper beside it, and he held them both. The freight's delivered, Roan said. His voice carried in the cold, quiet air, and the crowd had gone still to hear it. Whole and on the far side, signed for. The pay clears the debt with something left over. He held the man's eyes. You'll have your money, Drummond. Same as I told you. Same as I always told you. Vance's smile thinned. Of course. Of course. A small spread of the hands. I never doubted your word. No, Roan said. And here he stepped aside, and the crowd saw the boy on the sledge. Jess had eased himself upright, his bound ankle stretched before him, and his young face was pale but set, and his eyes had found Vance Drummond and would not leave him. He did, Jess said. His voice shook, but it did not stop. He doubted it so much he paid me to come up the mountain and watch this man die. The boy's words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water. I owe Mr. Drummond money, same as half of you standing here owe him money. And a few days back, he came to me, smooth as butter, and he said he'd clear my debt if I did him one small favor. Follow the freight man up the pass, keep an eye on him, and come back down and tell him whether the mountain took him. A murmur moved through the crowd, heads turned. Eyes that had been warm toward Vance Drummond a moment before had gone cold. He sent me up a killing pass. Jess went on, louder now, steadier, to watch a man freeze to death so he could take this family's land the cleaner for it. And he never once told me it might kill me too. It nearly did. I lay down in that snow to die, and I'd have died. And Mr. Drummond would have had two of us on his conscience and slept just fine. He pointed, and his hand did not waver. It's this man who pulled me out. The very man Drummond sent me to bury. He carried me through that storm on his own back. He gave me his own coat. He kept me alive all night with nothing but his own warmth and a wall built out of scraps. The boy's voice broke then, but he finished it. So I'll say my piece in front of everybody. I won't be doing Vance Drummond's dirty work. Not now. Not ever. And if there's any justice in this valley, none of you will either. The silence that followed was a terrible thing for Vance Drummond. He had built his power on quiet, on smiling, on being owed by everyone and feared by all, and never once being named out loud. And now he had been named, in the open, in front of the whole valley, by a boy he had thought too poor and too desperate to matter. The faces around him had changed. The men who had tipped their hats to him, the women who had lowered their eyes, they were looking at him now like people who have suddenly understood a thing they should have seen long ago. Old Tobias Wren stepped forward out of the crowd. He had warned a younger man not to take this road days ago in the freight yard. He had been wrong about the road. He was not wrong about this. I think, Tobias said slowly in a voice like gravel, that there's going to be a good deal of talk in this valley about what paper you hold, Drummond, and how you came to hold it. I think folks are going to start comparing notes. His old eyes were hard. I think your quiet days are over. Vance Drummond looked around the circle of faces, and he found in all of them not one that would meet his smile. He had wanted this land for reasons of his own. There was water beneath it, and a way through it, and a man who held both could hold a great deal more besides. He had been patient. He had been careful. He had been so very nearly there. And he had lost it all to a wall built of scraps, and a boy's honest voice, and a woman who would not say a word she did not believe. He did not bluster. Men like Vance Drummond never do. He simply settled his hat upon his head and turned and walked back through the parting crowd. And this time there was no courtesy in it, only retreat. The valley let him go. But the valley would not soon forget what it had learned. The debt was paid the next morning, plain and clean, with witnesses enough that no smiling man could ever twist it. The paper that had hung over the cabin like a held breath was made worthless, and the land belonged to the Calder family, free and whole, the way it always should have. And that, most people thought, was the end of the story. But it was not quite the end. Some weeks later, When the worst of the winter had loosened its grip and the high country could be reached again, 3 riders went up to the pass. Tobias Wren rode in front because he was the one who had to see it. Beside him rode Jess. Walking sound again now, his ankle healed, and no longer owing any man his life. And behind them came Roan Calder, who had not wanted to go back, and had gone anyway, because some things a man must look at in the daylight before he can be done with them. They found the shelter just as the storm had left it. The fallen pine still made its roof. The oak wagon bed still stood frozen into the earth, a wall in truth now, locked into the mountain by ice that would not melt for months. Della's patched canvas had hardened to a sheet of stone-hard frost over the layers of bough beneath. The grass-stuffed seams had vanished. The whole of it had become a single solid thing, sealed shut, impregnable. Tobias dismounted and stood before it a long while, saying nothing. He had spent his whole life moving through that country. He had seen men die on lesser slopes in lesser storms, and he understood, looking at this thing, that luck had not saved Roan Calder. Strength had not saved him either. A stronger man would have died just the same. The answer stood right in front of him, frozen into the side of the mountain. The wind had searched all night for a way inside. It had screamed and battered and probed at every seam, and it had never found one, because a man had thought of every path it might take, and had sealed them, one by one, with nothing but scraps and patience, and the last of his strength. "I told you this pass was a grave," Tobias said at last, quietly. "I was wrong. You made it a house." Roan stood beside the wall he had built and rested one gloved hand against the scarred oak. He thought of his brother. For years, this mountain had been the place that took Sawyer, the place he could not look at without the old stone settling onto his chest. He had carried that weight up here with him, the same as he'd carried it everywhere, for longer than he wanted to count. But it felt different now. Up here, in this shelter, in the long dark, he had finally done the thing he could not do the first time. He had reached someone in the snow. He had not let go. He had carried a freezing boy up an icy slope and breathed his own life into him and would not let the cold take him. And in saving that one stranger, he had been allowed, at last, to set down a part of what he'd carried. His brother was still gone. Nothing would ever change that. But the mountain was not only the place that took Sawyer anymore. It was also the place where a man had kept a promise his brother taught him. The place where the lessons Sawyer had given him, the low voice, the gentle hand, the trick of talking a frightened thing down to calm, had reached across the years and the grave and kept 3 living souls alive through a killing night. His brother had not died for nothing. His brother had taught him how to live, and how to keep others living. And up here in the worst hour of the worst night, every single thing Sawyer had ever given him had been used, and had been enough. Roan turned to Jess. The young man was looking at the shelter with the wide eyes of someone trying to understand the thing that had saved him. "You want to work the mountain routes," Roan said. "You told me that the night I found you." "I did." Jess flushed. "I was a fool about it." "No." Roan shook his head slowly. "You were young about it. That's a thing a man grows out of if he lives long enough." He gestured at the frozen wall before them. "But if you mean to work this country, you'd best learn the one thing that matters more than strength or luck or courage, and it's right here in front of you." He laid his hand on the oak. "You don't beat the mountain," Roan said. "You don't outmuscle it, and you don't outrun it. And God help the man who thinks he can outluck it. You survive it the same way you survive most hard things in this life. You find every place the cold can get in, and you seal them, one at a time, patient, the small ones especially. The small ones are what kill you, because you can't see them coming." He looked at the young man steadily. "And you don't leave anybody behind in the snow. Not ever. No matter what the arithmetic says. Because the arithmetic is wrong, Jess. It's always wrong. A man is never just one more weight to carry." His voice went quiet. "I learned that one the hard way. I'd as soon you learned it the easy way. From me, standing right here." Jess looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he nodded, and something in him settled. The way a thing settles when it has found, at last, its proper shape. The three of them stood there a while longer in the high, cold silence, before the strange and humble shelter that a desperate man had built out of a broken wagon and a fallen tree. Then they mounted up and turned their horses and started back down the mountain toward the valley. Below them, far below, a thin line of smoke rose from a cabin chimney into the clear winter sky. A stove that had been kept burning for a man the whole world had given up for dead. A woman who had refused to say the word the valley tried to give her. A boy who had believed a strip of leather could fix anything, and had been more right than anyone knew. Roan rode toward that line of smoke with a lightness in his chest he had not felt in years. The land was theirs. The debt was paid. The smiling man's power was broken. A boy who had been sent to watch him die now rode beside him, alive and free, and made better by it. And somewhere up on the mountain behind him, frozen into the granite, stood a small rough wall that would not melt until spring. Proof that the wind had hunted a man all through the longest night, and had never once found its way in. The storm had buried the road. It had not buried the man. And the man, riding home through the bright cold morning, carried down off that mountain something he had gone up without, and had thought, for a very long time, he would never have again. He carried peace.